Hi, this is Mr. Chandler. In this unit, we're looking at 1.4, which is the Articles of Confederation. In this unit, what we're going to look at is the government that's created after the Revolutionary War. And the key thing to understand about the government that's created after the Revolutionary War is that it's shaped by what happened before the Revolutionary War. So we're going to look at the Articles of Confederation. This is what was in place before our Constitution. The Articles of Confederation didn't really work. The main problem is that they're too weak. So we're going to look at the dissatisfactions with the government under the Articles. We're going to see how those dissatisfactions were addressed with the writing of the Constitution. And we're also going to look at some of the important debates and compromises like the Great Compromise and the Three-Fifths Compromise and see how the Constitution was actually ratified. The biggest problem was that does it create a weak central government? Well, why would they create a weak central government? They created a weak central government because they thought the British were too strong of a central government during the colonial days, and the British were taxing them without protecting their rights. So they thought the only way to protect people's rights was to create a weak central government. And that's why they did that. The Continental Congress was a model for this, and the authority in that government rested with the states and not the central government. That's going to be a big debate all the way up through the Civil War and even up to today. We're still talking about how much power the national government should have versus how much power the state governments should have. There are a few successes of the Articles of Confederation. I made it out like it was very weak and that was ineffective, and that's true, but there are a few successes that you need to know about. One of the successes had to do with land claims, large states versus small states. One of the issues was as we added new territory, because we owned all the way up to the Mississippi River, and you can see it on this map right here. We owned all the way up to the Mississippi River right there. You can see it on the map in front of you as well. So the question was, what were we going to do with those new states? What were we going to do with that territory? Was that territory going to be part of existing states? As you see on the map, you see like North Carolina extending and Georgia extending, or were those new territories going to be create new states? And so what they eventually decide through the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 is that all that western land is going to be given to the government, and the government's going to decide how it's going to be broken up. It also dealt with slavery a little bit. Any land in that Northwest Ordinance, which would be the Northwest Territory up here, was going to be free of slavery. There was going to be no slavery in that area. And so this is going to outline a future debate that's going to happen later in American history. So the system of creating new states was that these new states were going to be on equal footing with the original states. And some of those original states didn't like that. They wanted to get the territory for themselves and become even stronger. But the Confederation government didn't do that. They created new territories and new states. And that's a big success from the Articles of Confederation. Let me pause real quick just to talk about what the Articles of Confederation is. This is a written document that says how the government is going to run, and that's a very important idea to understand. There are some other successes too. It was effective under the Second Continental Congress during the Revolution. The reason it's successful during the Revolution is that they all have a common cause. They're trying to win the war. So as they're trying to win the war, they agree with each other. The problem is when that common cause is gone, they're not going to really want to work together. South Carolina is not going to necessarily want to help New York. South Carolina want to help themselves. It was effective on the state level as states passed new constitutions and passed laws that met their needs. And it's effective at negotiating the Treaty of Paris that ends the American Revolution. Now let's get into some problems with the Articles of Confederation. The main problem, like I said, all stems from the fact that it creates a very weak central government. And this is a major debate in American history. How strong should the federal government be? One problem is that the economy doesn't go very well, and that's because, well, we stopped trading with Great Britain, and they were our primary trading partner during the colonial days, and so we take out our primary trading partner, we don't have anyone to trade with. This leads to an economic depression, and it challenges the Confederate government. Some people can't pay their mortgages or state taxes, and this is going to lead to Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, which is going to scare the government officials because they're going to realize that the government's too weak to put down rebellions, and so they're going to get worried that there could be a major rebellion. Without the ability to pay for an army, we really couldn't have an army to put down rebellions. The Confederation government could not force states to pay for one, and they could not tax the citizens. It's essential for the government to be able to tax so that they can pay, say, an army. they can't tax, they can't pay an army. So what eventually happens after Shays' rebellion is that the elites in the country decide to send delegates to Philadelphia to revise the Articles. But what they ended up doing is they ended up writing a whole new constitution because Rhode Island didn't even show up. So under the new constitution, the national government was given the power to levy taxes so they can maintain an army to maintain domestic tranquility. That's important because I know we don't like the idea of taxes, and anytime taxes are raised, we get upset. But we need taxes in order to have an army and for the government to be able to fund different programs that they have. One other big problem was that the Confederation government could not resolve conflicts between the states. If, say, South Carolina and Georgia got into a dispute over interstate trade or boundaries or something like that, then there was no part of the national government to decide that. Today we have the judicial branch which resolves any of those conflicts, but back then there wasn't. So what would happen is these states would about go to war with each other. And so eventually after the Constitutional Convention is they create a judicial branch that's going to resolve those disputes between the states. And then they also give the national government power to control interstate trade. That means trade between states, so trade between Georgia and South Carolina. It also allows the government to control currency. Things that the government should be controlling to make sure that everything's running smoothly. Because that's really what the problem with the Articles is, things just didn't run very smoothly. There are other problems too. The Confederate government could not force the British to abide by the Treaty of Paris because we didn't really have much of an army, and because we didn't have taxes to pay for that army. The government could not persuade the British to continue trade with the United States. So there were some major problems. The inability to fund a standing army and continue to trade with Britain have both economic and diplomatic consequences. Without that trade, we don't have money, and then we also can't force them out of the land that is ours, and so the Articles of Confederation make our government too weak to be able to handle that. We also can't persuade Spain to allow Americans access to the sea through New Orleans, which is a very important port at that time, and Spain controlled it. All these states were trying to negotiate with foreign powers separately because the national government wasn't strong enough and the state governments were very, very strong, and so South Carolina would try to negotiate with a foreign country as opposed to the national government, which creates problems. The root problem is that there are no taxes. The diplomatic weaknesses lie with the fact that they couldn't taxes, they had to request funds from the states, and the states really didn't want to give them funds. And that's why they're not able to have an army. So as the Constitution is created, they try to fix those problems. The national government is given the exclusive right to make treaties with foreign powers, which makes sense that the whole United States should make treaties with foreign powers as opposed to individual states. One of the fears was that the southern states would give the federal government power to control international trade, and they fear that that's going to lead to the end of the slave trade. So they make a compromise that says that they can't end the slave trade until 20 years later. The biggest problem with the Confederation government was the inability to solve national problems. The states refused to acknowledge the authority and power of the central government. The Constitution fixes this by setting up what's called a federal system, in which power is shared between the states and the national government. So there are certain powers that the states have, and there are certain powers that the national government has, and it's very well defined. The obvious solution to all these problems was to fix the Articles of Confederation. However, it's going to take all 13 states to agree to any amendments, because that's another problem with the Articles, is it had to be unanimous for the Articles to be changed. Well, Rhode Island doesn't even show up. So the Constitution makes it easier to solve problems and to fix problems because it says you only need 3/4 of states to change the Constitution. So it's not easy, but it's also not impossible. And so it's important to be able to change the Constitution as we're going along because you can't always anticipate what problems there are going to be in a few years. And so that's why we have numerous amendments to the Constitution, new changes. And so it's not impossible to make changes to the Constitution, but it is important to make it hard to change the Constitution. And the Articles of Confederation, you couldn't change it at all. Another problem was the structure of the government. There's no executive branch, no one to carry out the laws. There's no president. And you can understand why they wouldn't have created a president, because they were afraid of having someone that was like a king who would take away their rights, like happened during the colonial days. There's also no judicial branch. No one to resolve disputes between the states, no one to resolve disputes between people in the country and the government. And so the judicial branch is a very important part. And so the Constitution establishes three branches of government: the legislative, which makes the laws; the judicial, which interprets the laws; and the executive, which carries out the laws. And then they put checks and balances in place to make sure no branch became too powerful. For instance, a president can veto a law that Congress has passed. Congress can also overturn that veto. Congress can impeach the president or impeach people in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court can declare laws and acts unconstitutional. So they all have power over each other through checks and balances. One of the important debates was the Great Compromise. The Articles of Confederation said that, or gave there's a unicameral one-house legislature with each state having one vote. What's going to happen during the Constitutional Convention is the bigger states like Virginia are going to say that they want representation to be based on population. And the small states are going to say they want a one-house legislature in which each state gets one vote. So by the Virginia plan, the big states are going to have more power because they have more people. And so that, say, Virginia, for instance, would have 30 representatives, while a smaller state like Rhode Island might only have 5. And so that the smaller states are worried that states like Virginia and New York would become too powerful. So what's going to eventually happen is they're going to meet in the middle. They're going to agree on a two-house system where you have a Senate and a House of Representatives. The Senate is where each state gets two members, and the House of Representatives is going to be based on population. So for instance, South Carolina has 7 members. California has 50-something members. So California has more power in the House of Representatives than South Carolina, but in the Senate, we are equal. All states are equal. And so that's balancing the New Jersey plan and the Virginia plan. Very important idea. The next big compromise is the 3/5 compromise. And it's based on, are slaves going to be counted as population or not? The South wanted to count their slaves as population so they'd have more votes in the House of Representatives. The North is opposed to that since slaves were really considered to be property and didn't truly represent the South. So what they eventually agreed to is the 3/5 compromise, which is going to allow the South to count 3 of every 5 slaves for representation numbers. And then it's also going to say that they're going to count towards property taxes as well. Sovereignty. This means the authority. So the authority of the Confederation government came from the states. The states gave the Confederation government power to rule over them. The way the Constitution solved sovereignty was that it gives the power to the people. If you notice in the Constitution it says, "we the people." And so it kind of went back to the idea of the Magna Carta, where no taxation without representation, and that people should be consulted when levying taxes, and said that the only reason the government can rule over us is because we let the government rule over us. So that's not kind of like the social contract theory as well. So we give the government the sovereignty. We give the government the authority to rule over us. There were some offices that weren't elected by the people, like the president. The president is elected by the Electoral College and still is today. The founders feared that the people in the country weren't smart enough to elect a president, and so they turned it over to the Electoral College. So people would vote for members to go to the Electoral College, who would then vote for the president. Today it's still in place, but it's not quite exactly the same. So it is more of a direct election today. Senators are also appointed by the state legislatures back then. Today they're elected by the people, but back then the state legislatures picked them. So the people really didn't have a say in the president or senators. And the reason for that was that they thought that the people didn't have enough knowledge to elect or to participate in an election. And then the justices of the Supreme Court are nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. So this whole part of the system of checks and balances. So there are some offices that weren't elected by the people. The form of government we had today didn't just happen. It wasn't an accident. That's not to say it was not an experiment. It certainly was. At the time, it's a big deal. It's a big change. The Articles was the first experiment, and honestly, it failed. It couldn't tax. It didn't have enough power. The Constitution was the second, and it has succeeded, mostly by changing what did not work and giving the people a chance to change the Constitution as needed. That's really important. The Constitution incorporated the same ideas and rights that were present in the early colonies: Magna Carta, rule of law, English Bill of Rights, and the experiences of the founders. This was the Enlightenment thinking of the day, and it involved compromise. So this is an amazing document which really solves a lot of our problems and helps us today as well. And we still have those same rights and still have those same beliefs. It was sent to a special state convention for ratification. They needed 9 of 13 states to ratify to become law, and it gets those. Where am I at?